Welcome to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a podcast about the United States and the world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'm your host, Michael Patrick Cullinane. Welcome back to the show. Before I get started, allow me a moment to give thanks to the Society for Historians of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, a sponsor of the show. The Society is the primary professional association for historians of this period, and they publish an exceptional journal called the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. If you like this show, you'll love the journal, and you might want to consider joining the Society. You can find out more on shgape.org. That's shgape.org. Now for today's episode. If you read a newspaper or watch cable television today, you might assume that migration to the United States, and even within the country, has never been more pervasive. There's talk of porous borders that dominates the headlines and the political dialogue, as does the assertion that the socio-cultural status in America is changing too quickly. But in actuality, we've heard all of this before. The great migration of African American peoples within the United States, the widespread immigration of peoples from overseas, and the immigration of people within the North American continent, it transformed America well before the 21st century. The numbers back in the late 19th century are more staggering than they are today, and the changes they wrought are more powerful, although the reactions are probably as visceral. Naturally, we are going to be speaking about this today, and it's a sociologist that joins me. I'm pleased to welcome Joseph Jewell to the show to discuss his latest book, White Man's Work, Race and Middle-Class Mobility into the Progressive Era. What this book does is it explores the interconnected nature of mobility, race, class, and gender. And it explains how social change sparked anxiety among white populations who felt threatened by the increased economic and cultural power of minorities and immigrants. Jewell also explains how racialized groups sought to defend against these anxieties. And for me, this is a topic that has always been a part of American history. It's particularly timely now ahead of the 2024 election because we have one candidate talking about retribution and another candidate that is talking about the American political tradition. It can make us feel like we're stuck in a political loop. John Greenspan, a former guest on the show, recently wrote an editorial in the New York Times comparing 2024 to 1892, when two unpopular candidates ran for the presidency and wound up restructuring ideas on class and race. And I'll put a link to that editorial in the show notes. But you also have Joseph Jewell today to explain that story in depth. Joseph is professor and department head of Black Studies at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is the author of Making of a Middle Class, the American Missionary Association in Black Atlanta, and I am delighted that he could join us. Welcome to the show, Joseph.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it is an exciting book for a lot of reasons, but I also want to say that this is a book that is an interesting number of case studies put together into a whole that becomes a really clear argument in the end when you put all of this together. But I want to start off, before we look at the communities of Atlanta, San Antonio, and San Francisco, I want to talk a little bit about terms and terminology first so that we can have a good grounding and foundation for things. Middle class is one of those terms that Gilded Age and Progressive Era folks, they know what it means. We all kind of know what that word means. But I think when you're an academic and you have to explain what middle class means, it gets a little bit more complicated. How does the identity of a middle class person mix in with then the identity of race and gender? And how do you define all of those things in your book?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. Okay. Well, I guess we'll start. We'll start with the middle class question. So, of course, even presently, there's no official definition of what middle class is. It's defined. It's measured. It's defined differently. So, depending on, say, income quartile. But then there's also the question of occupation, style of life. All of these things kind of figure into into what middle class is. So in the books, we're looking at the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, that sort of period, right? So I looked at quite a few resources, and they also describe the middle class as being anyone whose income, in addition to having a certain kind of occupation, And again, that sort of varies regionally. So there's also the question of what middle classes look like in different regions. But we're talking about people whose incomes range anywhere from $500 to $5,000 per year. And also you kind of figure in that the middle class is changing during this period. This is actually one of the reasons that I always sort of found myself drawn to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, because it was this incredible moment of conjuncture, as you and your readers know, our listeners know, that you're looking at this period where the artisans and small farmers and small businessmen who sort of predominate the middle class around the middle of the 19th century, their position gradually begins to decline, and they are being replaced by those folks who become sort of the clerical, white-collar managerial employees. Merchants still play an important part, but not as it's much more tenuous for them because the market is unstable. So even though the economy is growing, it grows in fits and starts, and there are these depressions and recessions that sometimes people who have these hard-won gains into the middle class are wiped out. So there's always this kind of fear of downward mobility, even as there is sort of the expectation that folks will continue to do well from one generation to the next, or the hope that they will.
So that is something that is so important, because this period in particular sees the development of the middle class as we probably know it today. And as you pointed out, it's different. But also what your book points out is that the development of racialized people, the development of racial ideologies, which really comes in many ways from the sociological work stemming from Darwin's theories, the scientification of race, if that's even a word, and then also the idea, well, I suppose maybe the first sexual revolution in the United States happens in this period too. So all of this is happening, and your book is trying to capture that. And what I'm sort of grappling with is, how exactly do you do that? I mean, I know how you do because I've read the book, but can you tell listeners how you approach this as like a research question?
So I was coming at this as a historical sociologist, and so there were these two things that I was really interested in. So one is this question of social mobility patterns among minoritized groups. And that was something that had always kind of intrigued me. But then there was also the point of the origins of contemporary racism. So as we're looking at sort of the present landscape of what race and racism look like, of course, we didn't sort of come to this. That's one of the insights, of course, that historical sociologists bring to things. It's like, how exactly did we get here, right? What was sort of the dress rehearsal for this, or the first act, maybe is sort of the better way to describe that. But then there was also this question of all of that sort of against this larger landscape of change, right? So this period of conjuncture that is the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, but not unlike some of the changes that we're seeing now: demographic change, economic instability, political conflict. It's like we've seen this before. So those things kind of drew me to this topic. And so coming at it that way, I was like, okay, so we know that there's this sort of relationship, this long historical relationship between class and race, and that's something that sociologists have grappled with, continue to grapple with, and taking really kind of an intersectional approach and saying, okay, let's look at sort of the race-class nexus, and what does this look like as a structural location? How is this reproduced over time? How does it change over time? And most importantly, which is sort of the where I sort of came into this, is sort of like, how do people live through this? How have people lived through these type of changes?
And your approach to writing the book too is somewhat intersectional, in the sense that you have a city in each chapter. You usually have an individual and an episode in each chapter, and then you've got a sort of broader contextualization, and it really works well. And I think it's something like I'd like to entertain as a writing method, is this sort of breaking it into these various parts. If we get into the weeds of all of this, I want to move into chapter 2 straight away. So in chapter 2, you look at Atlanta, which is the place. The non-white community that you look at in the case of Atlanta are African Americans, and the workers that you look at are postal workers. And there's a specific case here, which is the case of Charles Penny, who is a postal worker. He's a clerk in the registry department in the post office there. So multi-layered, intersectional. Tell us what happens in this affair.
So yeah, the Penny case, and I should also say too that sort of coming to these cases was, there was this kind of serendipity here, because of course I had this sort of larger project in mind about what I wanted to do, and it was going to be this sort of far-reaching study that looked at mobility across different groups in different cities. And fortunately, I had a senior colleague who's like, you maybe want to scale back a little bit if you want to finish this within a reasonable amount of time. And I said, okay.
That's a good colleague.
But yeah, so yeah, exactly. But yeah, so in the Charles Penny case, this was really kind of, and Atlanta is really kind of emblematic of some of these things that I wanted to capture, right? You have the emergence of a Black middle class. It is a southern city that has been transformed by the Civil War and emancipation. So there's new sort of occupational competition, sort of sorting itself out, neighborhood competition. And Charles Penny is kind of emblematic of this. So he graduates from Atlanta University, which is a missionary, HBCU that's established by Northern missionaries, and has this sort of reputation among whites in the state as giving sort of dangerous kind of education to African Americans, because they're preaching and practicing social equality on campus. But Penny, graduates, and he is recommended by one of the white trustees, who's actually a Northerner, for saying, hey, why don't you apply for this position in the U.S. Postal Service. And which, of course, for your listeners, they probably know about the Civil Service Reform Act, which of course makes this an exam-based thing. Patronage still plays an important part, but there's an exam-based set of requirements to do this. So Penny is the second highest score on the exam, and the U.S. Postal Service at that time and had this thing called the rule of three, which is the people who score earn the three highest scores on the civil service exam are then given sort of the sort of choice kind of opportunities. And the highest score was actually someone who was too young to actually take on the position. He hadn't quite turned 18 yet. And so the next highest score is Charles Penny, who is African American. And once he takes this position, it becomes, once news circulates that he has this position, it sort of blows up into this whole scandal, because the idea is that he's going to be working behind the counter in the registry department, and there's already a young white woman who is working there, supervised by her father. So this is, I guess, pre-rules about nepotism. But the father and daughter, Nathan Lyon and his daughter Mary, they resign in protest, and this becomes really kind of a huge scandal for the people of Atlanta, who are now suggesting that, there's not just this effort to have Black men replace white men who deserved the position, right? They're ignoring all the sort of the facts of the case, and they're just seeing, this guy, gets this job over someone who's white. And there's also the threat of sexual predation by Black men, which is becoming this kind of popular trope. And it's sort of this way that these things kind of get refit into this occupational setting, which is what I found really fascinating about this work, is how these racial stereotypes then sort of get refit into these new settings.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, actually, in all of these cases too. But tell us, what's the outcome of that particular case with Penny and the Lyons, right? It's the Lyons family, the daughter and the father there. How does it like reverberate? What you talk about is like the anxieties and the suitability for people to be in these professional positions.
Well, initially, and it's kind of strange to see how this kind of changes over time. So, initially there's this outrage about Penny taking on this job as a clerk, and there are all of these efforts to have Penny ousted. There are mass protests in the city about Penny getting this position. He stays in the position for a few years, but not without all of this kind of fanfare and these threats, and there are even people who actively support Nathan and Mary Lyons, and so they get this kind of outpouring of support from the white public, and the white trustee who actually nominated Penny for this, who is a local sort of official in the who was a local sort of Republican official who later who was a postmaster when he made Penny's appointment, is actually threatened with expulsion from the Capital City Club, which is sort of this elite club for white men in the city, where he's brought up on morals charges by the members for placing as it said, placing a Negro in an office with a white woman. But eventually that dies down, and Penny remains in the position for a couple of years before he moves on to something else. But what this kind of gives rise to is now it's Black letter carriers or mail carriers who now become this sort of a bête noire for everyone. Initially it was there was the idea that mail carriers are fine, right, but clerks are something else. But as they see that Black men are gaining entry into the Postal Service as letter carriers and making a decent living and educating their children and purchasing homes, there's this whole fear or this they're stealing from the mail, they're corrupt, and even later on it even gets to be like, and there's this, again, the looming threat of sexual predation comes up when Black men when there's attempt to assign Black men to rural routes, where like, white women are going to be at home alone while their husbands and brothers and sons are out in the fields, and having Black men with the freedom to kind of go anywhere they wish and come by these abandoned houses. What does this mean for the safety of white women? And so it becomes really kind of this statewide effort to do away with Black men in the Postal Service. And so it manifests in other places like Savannah and Bibb County, where Macon is, and all of these other places.
I mean, it does seem like an excuse as well. I mean, it made me think of the case in Indianola, Mississippi, which was the postmistress, Minnie Cox,
yes,
a female who was basically, the post office was closed by the president because the locals wanted they wanted a white postmaster, basically a male and white. And so there's a lot of really interesting sort of intersections here, as you point out. And I just wonder how much that changes in America from that Gilded Age, or if we want to kind of make that distinction between the earlier period to like 1914, when Woodrow Wilson segregates the federal workforce. Is there a gradual shift that you see, especially amongst the African-American community in the United States?
Yes, absolutely. So initially, and it's kind of, again, this gradual thing that happens in Atlanta. And I should also kind of point out quickly that this whole sort of anger or distaste for Black mail carriers actually kind of erupts in violence, and it becomes commonplace for whites to attack Black men who are carrying the mail, or who they feel do not sort of conform to old, what they call sort of the old time Negro. And they talk about this distinction between the highly educated after the war Negro versus the who are pursuing jobs like this, versus the old time, quote unquote, old time Negroes who are respectful, who know their place. And it becomes sort of this generational thing as well. But this whole violence against postal carriers, I was kind of immediately kind of struck by it, because I said, wait, this sounds very familiar. And I remember reading Walter White's autobiography and all these sort of discussions of it, where he talks about the Atlanta race riot and how the homes of Black mail carriers, or at least his father was a mail carrier, their home was specifically attacked and called out as the home of that in mail carrier. I don't know if I should say that word. But yeah, it sort of becomes this thing. But yeah, there is this sort of gradual sort of move as time goes on, that Black mail carriers, who are initially part of this larger kind of postal workers union, where some of them even get some positions of authority in it, then end up sort of forming their own postal workers union, right? That is sort of a response to being excluded or shut out from places, because as the union has its conventions, they go to segregated hotels or they go to other places where Black members are not welcome. And so they sort of take it upon themselves to organize them. But it remains really this really seen as this prestigious job within the African American community. There's even a discussion in one of the Atlanta University studies, talking to young children, and young boys are saying that, yeah, one of the jobs that they could aspire to, see themselves aspiring to, is being a mail carrier, because it's one that carries prestige and respect.
And authority too. I think you point out in your book that there is an attack on a bus on a postal carrier, an African American postal carrier, by a white man who encouraged him to get out of his seat for someone else, and he hit him, he struck them, and they they tried to sue, because if you strike a mail carrier, it's a federal offense, right? So
Right.
I mean, and he didn't go to jail, right? I mean, that's the story. He didn't even get arrested or fined.
No, not at all. I mean, there was this whole discussion of in the courts about, and the judge, rules that, well, the uniform of a postal carrier does not protect its wearer in all situations. And again, sort of asserting the idea that, Black people, particularly this younger generation, they have become too educated for their own good, right? They don't conform to and this judge actually laments the manners and respect that were shown by the old, quote unquote, old time Negro.
So look, that's another theme in here, and it's something that really struck me about the book. And I don't know if you want to tell us if this was something that you had decided to put in, or if this was a little bit of that good luck that you had. But all of these case studies that you look at, there's a degree of authority bestowed by a uniform on these employees. So in the case of African Americans in Atlanta, it's the postal workers, but we're going to talk about police in Texas, and we're going to talk about customs officers in California. All of these carry a degree of authority. And so I want to come back to that theme at a later stage. But if chapter 2 was complicated, chapter 3 gets even more tangled up for me as well. So we were talking a little bit about these sort of racial tropes that are being created and then reshaped just through the reality of people that are being racialized being in a position of authority. Well, in chapter 3, you look at Tejanos, which are Texas descendants of Spanish Mexican and Mexican Americans. I mean, a really complex lineage by all accounts. And Tejanos, as you discuss, is even more fluid when you get to the Gilded Age, because we're talking about, well, I'll let you explain this, but we're talking about people in authority that are now taking on almost a new racial identity in the Gilded Age, Tejanos, right?
Yes, exactly. So what I found sort of fascinating here, again, sort of drew me to this, is, I'm sort of looking through, these newspaper accounts, and I'm just like, there's something here, because there seems to be this kind of focus really on, initially, there's this focus on policemen as, as sort of, protecting the population of this booming city of San Antonio, which is, identified as, people see it as the quote unquote the American city in the borderlands. Really trying to sort of say, yes, we have a sort of quaint Spanish Mexican past, but we are really kind of an American city. And then sort of what that ends up meaning for people of Mexican origin who are living there, either those who are what were called tejareños, so the folks who were sort of the descendants of the original settlers of what later became San Antonio, or some of the more sort of, or people who are more recent migrants from Mexico who are coming into the United States. But there's already sort of this pre-existing notion that Mexicans are somehow a dangerous or a criminal element, and then of course that goes back to the war, the U.S.-Mexico War, where Mexican combatants were sort of painted as they are mongrels, they are in need of civilization, they're racial inferiors. But even then, there's this sort of like back and forth really about like, well, some of them may be safely counted as white if they are Spanish or Castilian, or if they're wealthy enough, or so even there, the racial boundaries that I refer to here, rather than sort of being consistently bright, they are really kind of blurred in some periods. And as San Antonio grows into sort of this, sort of becoming this modern city, there's the need for a police force because it is still sort of seen as this kind of outpost in the West, and who's going to do the policing. And I was really kind of surprised to see, like, oh wow, there's this kind of strong kind of contingent of Tejanos who are working as police officers, but not just any Tejanos. These are often the sons of folks who had been landowners, right? So that kind of landed gentry that had been so much a part of the Southwest that experienced decline after annexation, after the war. Those are the folks. Their sons really end up working as police officers. And strangely enough, you have sort of this, at the same time that you have this happening, there is this of like, okay, well, but Mexicans are associated, and they would use the term Mexicans, right? Mexicans are associated with crime. Mexicans are associated with gambling and immorality and disorder, right? The whole west side of San Antonio, or much of the immediate sort of west side of San Antonio, was seen as this place where there were houses of prostitution, gambling dens, saloons, all of the kind of vices that Anglo-Americans, at least on paper, despised, even though they were often making use of them themselves. But then it's like, okay, you also have Mexican Americans, Tejanos, who are working as police officers. And they are not referred to in the same kind of racialized language as people who may commit crimes. And so there's this weird kind of like, okay, what's really, so again, as a historical sociologist looking at race, I'm like, okay, so what's going on here? And it's like, okay, yeah, this is that blurred racial boundary, where it's like they're recognized as being of Mexican origin, but they are not of the same group or order or class as these other folks who are associated with crime and criminality. But you move from this period where Mexican American Tejano officers are lauded for their heroism in chasing down desperados, in saving people. So in the case of Jacobo Coy, who is, and this is kind of this famous shooting at the Vaudeville Theater, which has been written about by a number of sort of amateur historians and other people, but there's really no mention made of the fact that, well, one of the chief people who is credited with stopping the gunfight in this saloon, and stopping people from being killed, is Tejano, right? Jacobo Coy, and he's referred to in many of the as Jake Coy, so they even kind of anglicize his name, but that he was one of at least sort of 40 officers who were of Tejano origin. But again, so over time, as this narrative of this sort of this Mexican crime discourse emerges, where criminality and Mexicanness are indelibly linked. Over time, there is this sort of association with Mexican American officers or Tejano officers, and violence or immorality, or they don't quite make it in terms of being and fitting this kind of mold of middle class manliness, even as they are really sort of engaging in activities that people associated with this, particularly in a place like San Antonio, which is simultaneously Southern, Southwestern. It kind of really defies categorization in that way. But that Black men who are accused of sexual assault are being chased down by Tejano officers, and there's no mention made of the fact that the Tejano officers are of some kind of different racial category. It's like they're basically subsumed under whiteness for those purposes.
And that's what I found most interesting about the chapter, because the story about, say, for example, one that we probably know better is the story of how the Irish became white. And often it's the police force that helps do that as well. But you write about this really interestingly, because you say off-white, that the Tejanos become off-white. I wasn't sure if that was a quote from another source or if that was your own.
Yes.
Okay. But I thought that was really interesting, because it can be taken away as well. It's like you're white momentarily, and that gets you certain status, but actually that can be taken away. It's not entirely white. Like it's a slightly different distinction for Tejanos than it was for the Irish, say. And this is where the sort of myth of race comes into all this, really, isn't it? Is that, this is a social construct that has no real basis in reality except for what the prevailing norms are.
Exactly, yes. And that term off-white actually comes from the work of Laura Gomez, who was writing about New Mexico during sort of an earlier period. And again, also sort of looking at the criminal justice system there and sort of how people were defined as either belonging or not belonging. But I think it necessarily complicates that story because we're so sort of focused on, okay, well, how did certain groups of European immigrants become white, and then the whiteness is kind of like there, right? And there are sort of two sort of complications there. It's like one, there are folks who are saying it's like, well, this wasn't really a boundary, this idea of what they didn't necessarily become white in the sense that they were non-white and they became white. It's like this was a boundary inside of whiteness where it's like, okay, for all intents and purposes, they were white. They may have been treated as social inferiors within whiteness, but they were not really sort of legally and in terms of access to things really sort of defined as non-white. Whereas you look at a group like people of Latin origin, and it's this kind of like, okay, yeah, this really shows that instability because it's like, yeah, there are moments when they are considered white, and then there are moments when they're not, and it's better to kind of see it, I think, or more accurate to kind of see it as this sort of consistently moving thing, right? And so looking at the experiences of people who, as I describe, are sort of generally or consistently, or in some cases kind of durably identified as non-white, it's a very sort of different story about how racial boundaries work. And I think that as Sibel Fox and Thomas Guglielmo point out in this great piece that they did about racial boundaries, and they point, it's like, the case of Latin folks maybe has more to tell us about how racial boundaries work, more so than sort of the European case.
Absolutely. I think still today with the census and how we set up boundaries within the census, which is an official document, I guess, and tally of people is the same. White and Hispanic are often conflated, taken apart, put back together, and then it's been a long story. And San Francisco is another familiar tale that you tell in the book. That's in your last chapter about Chinese American Dick Williams, who is he's an interpreter and a customs agent, or enforcement officer, I should say, and he gets accused of corruption and bribery. And so I need you to tell us that story.
Right. Well, and again, this was one of those like, wow, this is like really, sort of incredible, sort of finding all of these stories. This is, there's something here sort of guiding me to all of these different stories, sort of putting them together. But yeah, that was one that I really didn't sort of expect to come across, this idea of like, well, how is this sort of playing out in the case of Asian immigrants, in this case specifically Chinese people of Chinese origin in San Francisco. And so here, yeah, Richard Williams, who is, and it's looking at, I just want to do a great, shout out to the fact that, all of these records are now digitized. I was sort of having to do a lot of this research during COVID when there were a lot of places that were sort of closed. And I'm just like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. I mean, there are all of these great records that are here. But yeah, in the Williams case, it's like, this is a man who is of mixed racial origin. So his mother was an Irish immigrant, and his father was a Chinese immigrant. And this is kind of like me sort of piecing together what's available kind of in the census. But he is, he's essentially, to many people, he's white appearing. And so there are cases where it seems like he's sort of passing, right? But he is also engaged in this kind of as part of this bicultural Chinese American community that really sort of begins to emerge during the Exclusion era, as someone who is giving tours of Chinatown to whites who want to sort of explore the exotic, and he manages to become sort of very well connected this way and gets a job with what at that time was called the Chinese Bureau, which is sort of this agency that is basically given over to or charged with enforcing the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is the weird thing, because initially the job as a customs officer, or what was called then a Chinese inspector, yeah, very strange title, was really sort of reserved for white men. But of course, you have the problem that, well, there aren't enough white men who are Chinese speakers at that time, right? And Williams, who becomes very close with the customs customs officers there, actually becomes really sort of he's the first Chinese American Chinese inspector. But it's clear that this is happening simply in large part because of A, his connections, and B, his sort of white passing appearance. And he is engaged in some corruption, but here's the thing: it's like, basically everybody was on the tape. Because and you kind of see at the same time, we have this kind of ambivalent relationship with immigrant labor. It's like, we hate immigrants, but we really sort of want their labor, we want their work. And so he is on the, and so, Williams, like some of the other folks, are actually on the take in terms of having these relationships with local, what are called sort of labor importers, but they're actually like smuggling people in. He gets caught, and part of the whole argument that's made about his dishonesty is that, okay, well, he has this sort of lavish lifestyle. He lives in this really sort of exclusive neighborhood. He dresses too well for someone who's a civil servant. And then there's the, this suspicion that, he might be part Chinese. And again, this was something that folks probably knew, but were willing to sort of turn a blind eye because of the labor need. But of course, then it becomes a convenient weapon as a way to kind of push him out, and also kind of blame the corruption that exists in the Chinese Bureau on anyone who is of Chinese origin. And so it's in the wake of his case that there's this effort to actually have this rule in place that no one known to have Chinese ancestry can work in or around the Chinese Bureau, because of course they will, give over to their, they're going to be sort of morally compromised, or they're going to be politically compromised. And all of these newspaper drawings, which was sort of another kind of fascinating piece of this, you see that, Williams has, at least as the way he's depicted, he has this kind of ambiguous appearance, but his daughter and his wife appear in court to support him, and his daughter is actually depicted with having some kind of Chinese features, or we should say Asian features. And so there is this kind of effort to say, yeah, so you have to sort of really be cautious, because this idea that blood will always tell. But this sort of and the Chinese Bureau really sort of becomes this place where you sort of meet this sort of this clash of, we need Chinese speakers, and we can't hire them as full-fledged civil servants, but we can create this sort of special classification for them. But in short, it gets very messy. And in some cases, in one sort of notable case, one of the people who actually ends up replacing Williams and actually becomes really sort of the second and longest lasting Chinese inspector of Chinese origin, is John Endicott Gardner, who is also of Chinese ancestry. But it's very clear from the way the federal government is treating him and everyone else that, this is we're treating him as a white man. We're regarding him as white. And so these rules don't apply to him. And there are some papers that try to bring this up as, aren't you kind of contradicting your own, aren't you in violation of your own rules? And it's like, they just kind of dismiss it out of hand. So you have this kind of informal ban that remains in place, even as you have this continuing need for people who speak Chinese. And that would be folks who are part of what historian Mei Nai calls this interpreter class that again sort of emerges in this period.
Really glad you mentioned the newspapers, and I'm really glad that you included them in the book itself. So, for anyone listening, you can see images from the newspapers in the books, including drawings, as well as just some of the headlines. And I wanted to ask you about what role the press plays in building some of these anxieties, as you call them. I mean, are there some, I mean, you must have read a lot of newspapers for the research, but are there some that are merely covering the news, as like the New York Times would put on the front page, like all the news that's fit to print, or are all of them in part creating this psychic crisis in America?
Mm. Oh, that's such a great question. I think it really kind of lends itself to this kind of regional argument, because even though, like in the case of I want to say in the case of what gets covered in, say, some of the national papers occasionally as sort of like the quote unquote the race war in the post office that ends up happens when people are looking at what's happening in Atlanta and other places in the South where Black mail carriers are being assaulted. Or certainly the vaudeville theater shootout that Jacobo Coy was instrumental in helping stop. That sort of covered, and there, and so these things are sort of talked about. But really, what happens in sort of the regional newspapers, right, is where this is sort of hyped up as this is really kind of a threat to white society. The fact that these non-white men, right, are entering into middle-class jobs, and there's this threat of what that means for white men's futures, for the safety of white women who are entering the workforce and who may be in physical proximity to some of these workers. And so, yeah, what I found in each one of these sort of the papers in these regional cases is that they were the ones who really kind of fed this kind of hysteria. And I said, yeah, this is really kind of a national phenomenon, and it sort of underscored the fact that at the same time that we have this kind of overarching national idea about race, that really in this period we're still sort of like piecing this together into this larger national kind of racial ideology about whiteness and non-whiteness, that this plays out differently in different regions, and sort of these local kind of racial understandings then sort of get woven into this larger narrative, right? And I thought that was, again, particularly fascinating here, because we often think of like, oh, there's this sort of larger idea of what white supremacy looks like, but recognizing that no, this plays out differently in the Southwest or in the South or in the West, and what that means for people who are on the wrong side of the color line, as it were.
Yeah, that's so fascinating that there's a national experience, there's these regional newspapers, and there's these very individual stories. I love that your book does that. And what I also really like is that you started with the proposition that this matters now, because in a lot of ways, the reason why this book has to feature on this podcast is because the podcast is dedicated to telling the story of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era and why it's relevant for today. And you make a very, very clear case. And maybe historians don't do as good of a job as sociologists do in this, but it shouldn't come to a surprise as anyone that the United States has this toxic mix of authoritarianism, racism, classism, sexism. But when you hear stories like these three cases and these three cities in your book, it's just impossible to deny that. And that makes your book really timely, because I feel like we're at another point of significant social change. And in reading your conclusion, I have no doubt that you agree about that. Without asking you to make any forecasts, because you look backwards rather than forwards, I think, how does your book plug into the anxieties that we see today, and what does it mean for the present?
Mm. Oh, another great question. Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I was always drawn to the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, just because I saw that conjuncture as being so very much like the one we're experiencing currently. And I think as I was, as I was finishing this book, just as I was trying to finish it up, it's like, we saw what happened on January 6th. And that sort of like, um, obvious kind of or very sort of palpable kind of backlash to progressive politics, and then comes the in what follows the targeting of DEI, the sort of a public vilification of people who really sort of represent this changing face of the middle class, right? So this idea that the middle class that existed in the 1970s, which was largely seen as still seen as a sort of largely kind of non-Hispanic white entity, is now shifting, right? And the middle class is much more race plural than it has been previously. And the anxieties that people have about that, and what that means when people are moving into positions of authority, and the same kinds of claims that emerge, birtherism, or this idea of people referring to DEI as didn't earn it, right? The idea that people are in these positions because of either DEI-related policies or affirmative action that people don't understand and see as being unfair, and all of these kinds of things. And they tie into what another sociologist, British sociologist Les Beck, refers to as this kind of idea of middle-class racisms and these old themes of being swamped by outsiders, about them being untrustworthy, and this idea of unfairness when it comes to competition for resources. So yeah, these kinds of things really are emerging at this critical moment. We've seen this happen in earlier periods as well. I mean, one of the cases that I was sort of thinking about, and this kind of maybe leads me to something I'll do next, is thinking about, wow, this is from what I've read about the Dreyfus affair, from what I've read about other places, like this is really a this kind of revolt against change or new faces in the middle class, really kind of sparks this kinds of outrage, and there are definitely these themes that keep sort of popping up in different times, different places.
All right, and let me ask you one more question about this, and this is it. Now, I promise I won't push you any further. But are there any professions that you see today where these conflicts are becoming more apparent? I mean, I think the world of tech is a really interesting one, because we might think of the massive changes that happened with the industrialization of America, which you talk about. The information revolution that we're seeing today seems comparable in some ways, or at least there might be some parallels, but you would know better than anyone because you've thought about this more than anyone. Are there any professions where we see this intersectionality where race becomes a factor or decreases as a factor, where say, for example, someone's status is elevated because they're in this profession currently, and that might change the way the broader society thinks about race or sex or whatever?
Mm. Oh, wow, that's good, and that's also a tough one because it's hard to kind of map. I mean, I think some of the more visible things that we're seeing are probably certainly in higher education. I think again, a lot of the attacks on DEI are happening in higher education, and the fact that these are often people who are from minoritized groups, whether that has to do with race or gender or sexuality, who are working in these professions and now are being targeted as oh, this is this is bad for the institution, this is bad for us, and jobs are sort of being wiped out, or people are being targeted in that way. I was also thinking about the Brennan Center's report about public officials, and how they are experiencing this kind of unprecedented level of hostility and personal attacks, particularly if they happen to be of belong to a racial or ethnic minoritized group. Another sort of parallel that came up as I was writing this was this whole question about policing, and looking at some of the trends there, and saying, like, I was thinking about what was happening in certain cases where it's like, is this really going to sort of be the next place where it's like, okay, we talk about sort of the makeup of law enforcement, but we don't really sort of look at, okay, well, how is this really sort of being discussed internally, and what does this mean for folks who are working in these professions dealing with the public? So it's kind of, in some ways, it's still kind of an open question. I'm still sort of trying to see, are there particular professions that are, but we definitely see, I think, some of the legacies of that. So the efforts to scale back on things like the Postal Service, and the fact that the Postal Service is still one of the of the federal agencies still employs the most African Americans. And so what's happening there, or with public education as well. One of the cases that I sort of came across and didn't have time to sort of get into, because your editors say you have this many words and that's it. But there was a slightly kind of similar attack that emerged in Atlanta in that period, looking at African American women who were school teachers, and the idea that, oh, are they stealing copies of the state exam, right? And this whole kind of backlash against public education, and what does that mean for African American women and Latinx women and other women who are from these groups who are working as public school teachers, who are now sort of facing this kind of backlash as well. So I think in some ways it's too soon to tell, but there are definitely sort of concerning things that are happening there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Joseph. This book is brilliant. I love it for its structure. I love it for its content. And I really am so happy that you came onto the show to get into further depth. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoy the podcast. And so it's been an honor to speak with you.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks for listening. You can follow the Gilded Age and Progressive Era on Twitter or on my website, michaelpatrickcullinane.com. Please consider subscribing or reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, because it really makes a big difference and helps direct others to the show. I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.